Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today. It's Monday, October 12th, 2020. Got several folks joining on. Good to see you. Good morning, Mr. Danny. Hope you're doing well today. And everybody else that's joining on. Hope you're doing well today. All right. So we are ready for Revelation chapter 12 today. Good morning, Wayne from Tyler, Texas. Hope you're doing okay out there. Looks like I'm having some trouble here in the beginning. Hopefully that's not a sign of things to come here. Let me know if everything is okay out there. For some reason, OBS on my end is showing issues. Well, there it goes. Hey, Debbie. Good morning, Paula and Connie. All right, we are ready for Revelation chapter 12. So just to head back a little bit, we looked at chapter 10, which John ate, a bittersweet little book. And I told you that my belief on that, just looking at the overall context and the rest of the book of Revelation, that little book that he ate that became bittersweet was the rest of what we call the book of Revelation, the rest of what would be revealed to him. And then you get into, let me get my Bible, I'm in the wrong chapter here. Let me get over here to Revelation chapter 11. You get to chapter 11, and you have God's calls. Good morning, Anita Bates, and possibly Roger. You have God's calls seemingly being put to death, these two witnesses that we see, but they are resurrected. God's cause is vindicated. And then you have that seventh angel sounding. Good morning, Diana. Good morning. Well, Gail, I've already told you good morning, but yeah, for some reason it froze up there for just a minute, but I think we're okay now. If there are any further issues, please let me know, and I'll see if I can do anything. Anyway, the seventh trumpet sounded in Revelation chapter 11, and it announces in that trumpet that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So what the rest of Revelation does is illustrate that battle and the victory that Christ is ultimately going to have, okay? The little book, Revelation chapter 10, I think is the rest of the book of Revelation. Chapter 11 shows the vindication of God's cause, the ultimate victory that it's going to have, and then from beginning in chapter 12, we have that picture, or we have that battle pictured for us in various ways. Good morning, Miss Sharon. Thank you, Wayne. I think everything is okay now. I don't know why it started out slow, but anyway, here we are. So let me go ahead and pull up the outline here and get this going on the screen. I've got this all jacked up, so give me just a second here to get it arranged properly for your viewing. I forgot to do this ahead of time today. We were out driving yesterday. The family and I were out driving yesterday and had a blowout. One of our tires just completely gave way. And so I've been trying to get that figured out this morning and answering some messages that I had on my computer. All right, I think I have that fixed up for you now. Looks good on my end. So now the outline for Revelation chapter 12 is on your screen. And in fact, I just had another message come in, so I'm going to go ahead and mute my speakers so you don't hear all that noise in the background. All right, here we go. Revelation chapter 12, the woman, the child, and the dragon. As I said again, chapter 11 kind of gives us a foreshadowing of what's going to be happening in the rest of the book. The battle that's taking place between Christ and his servants and Satan and his servants. Chapter 12 really sets this off. Now, in the first 6 verses here of Revelation chapter 12, you have a woman pictured, and the Bible tells us here that, now, let me say this first. As you open chapter 12, you notice the first couple of words. Now, a great sign appeared in heaven. The word great there in the Greek language is mega. Okay, this is massive. This really stands out to John, as obviously as all of these signs would, but a mega sign in heaven appears. There's a woman, and notice how this woman's described here. She's clothed with the sun, the moon is under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. So all these sources of light are around this woman. She's radiating, you might say, in the heavens. This woman is with child. What we need to do, as with every other passage in the book of Revelation, is with these symbols, let the text tell us what the symbols mean. Okay? We're going to find out very quickly who this child is that this woman is pregnant with. The woman, well, let's just keep reading here, verse 3. Another sign appeared in heaven, a great fiery red dragon having seven heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. Now you skip down to verse 9, and we learn immediately who that dragon is. The great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan. So again, let the text define the symbolism, all right? We know who this dragon is, this fiery red dragon. Well, who would Satan, or who would this dragon naturally be fighting against? God, God's people, God's cause. And so I think this woman here that is again radiating in the heavens with the sun and the moon and the stars is symbolic. Again, the nature of the book, signified, Revelation chapter 1, is symbols. This woman is symbolic of the light, if you will, or the example of God's people in the world. But let's keep reading before we get any further into that. So this dragon, Satan, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems. This is a powerful being, okay? And Satan is powerful. There's no question about that. The dragon, let's see. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who is ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, who is this child? Well, it's a male child, verse 5, who would rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Okay, there's your answer. This male child is the Christ. Psalm chapter 2 and verse 9. In fact, I've got that in your outline here. So just looking at a couple of things in your outline. Once we identify the child, okay, we know who the woman is. It's a male child, rule the nations, and he's caught up with God to his throne, verse 5. So there's no doubt that this male child is Christ. Now this woman, who is this? Well, there are varying ideas, again, as is very typical with the book of Revelation, with all these signs and symbols. There are different ideas, and probably nearly as many different ideas as there are different commentaries on the book of Revelation. Let's look at a couple things. Number one, the woman cannot be the church, because the church did not give birth to Christ. Now, I know Roman Catholicism has some pretty strange ideas about the church. Just for instance, they believe the church gave us the Bible. They've got it in the wrong order. The Bible gives us the church. It talks to us about the church and the design of the church and the function of the church. The church didn't give us the Bible. It's not the Catholic Church. The woman can't be Mary. Okay, this isn't Mary. She's not the one in the heavens with the sun and the moon and the stars. And you look at verse 6, it says, the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Well, Mary never did that. She never fled into the wilderness to be fed by God. Remember the symbolism. The woman represents what is called the faithful remnant of God's people. I mean, you think about it, the promise of Christ, the promise of the birth of Christ goes all the way back to the days of Abraham. Again, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. This woman who is clothed in this magnificent way, as it's described in verse 1, is symbolic of God's people throughout the ages, who ultimately, the Jewish nation, of course, we understand, produced the Christ. So I've got some verses in there for you, Micah chapter 5, and you can look at these other verses, Isaiah 9, Psalm chapter 2, and then you see the fulfillment of those prophecies of Christ, and it's recorded specifically in Acts 13, verses 32 through 39. So this woman of Revelation 12 symbolizes God's people throughout time, God's faithful, the remnant, if you will. The dragon, or Satan, has constantly been in battle against God's cause and against God's people throughout time. Again, you notice his description I have here in the outline for you. He's red, verse 3. Red in the book of Revelation is a symbol of war. Remember the red horse we read about earlier. 7 heads and 10 horns. This is talking about power and influence, and the diadems or the crowns. So I put this in your outline. And again, I'm reading from a New King James Version here. It says in verse 3 of this dragon, 7 diadems on his head. Now, I've told you in previous studies that in the book of Revelation there are two different two different crowns in the Greek language. There is the diadem and there is the Stephanos. Satan never has the Stephanos, because the Stephanos is the victory crown of the games, of the Olympic Games as we call them. The diadem is always a governmental, a political, or a power crown. Now, Satan has that, but he never has the victory crown. Only Jesus has the victory crown, and only the faithful have the Stephanos, the victory crown. So that's an important distinction to make, because we do in the English, we see the word crown. The Greeks had two different words for that, and knowing the difference between the two crowns helps us understand what we're dealing with here. God's people are under persecution by the dragon. She's in the wilderness. Again, verse 6, she's under protection by God. Doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen, but God sees and knows what's going on. So this male child is born. Verse 5, he's going to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Again, that's specifically a reference to Christ. And the child was caught up to God and to his throne. And of course, that ultimately happened with Christ as well. So we know what those symbols mean. All right, now look at verses 7 through 12. Now, this particular passage here, Revelation 12, verses 7 through 12, has been a pretty abused passage, you might say. War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail. That is, the devil and his dragons did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceived the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Here's what I want you to understand. John is seeing, again, you go back to verse 1, a mega sign, a great sign in heaven. This battle that he's talking about here in Revelation 12, verses 7 through 12, is not some prehistoric, literal war that took place in heaven. God doesn't have to fight any wars in his own throne room like that. That's not what's happening here. Some people mistake it. They go back to Isaiah 14. They say, well, this is Lucifer being cast out from heaven. No, it's not. This is only symbolic language talking about the battle of the forces of God versus the forces of Satan. And the battle is ongoing. And Satan is going to lose. I mean, that's the whole point here. And one thing that this particular passage does remind us, if you look particularly at verse 9, it reminds us of Satan's realm of influence. They're cast out to the earth. And so I have here for you, and I'm going to turn over to it real quick, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. This is in the context of the Christian putting on the armor of God. Ephesians 6, verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenlies, in the heavenly places. This earth is Satan's realm of influence. Now, he's not in control of it. He's limited in his power. Remember, he was given the key. Remember the book of Job. Satan is limited. He's not all powerful. But this is where he functions. This is where he operates. This is where he makes war with the Lamb. And so Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9 lets us know all of that stuff, that his power is limited and that this is his realm of influence. Verses 10 and 11 remind us that even though they may be persecuted, God's people will be victorious. So look at verse 10. I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, again, that's Satan, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast out. He's been defeated. Again, remember the initial audience. Remember that this was originally written to Christians of the first century who are under, currently, persecution from Rome. This message would help them. How did they overcome? By the blood of the Lamb, verse 11, and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. That's the meaning of Revelation 2 and verse 10. When Jesus told that congregation, be thou, I think that's Smyrna, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life. This is what that means. Even when it cost them their lives, they did not give up. They held on faithfully. That's where the victory is. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Satan's power and time is limited, and that's what we're seeing here in Revelation chapter 12. Then we skip down to verses 13 to 17. The dragon couldn't devour the child, the male child that was born. He couldn't defeat Christ, so what is he going to do? He's going to go after Christ's family. He's going to go after God's children. That's me and you. And again, for the first century Christians, obviously that would be them. So we start reading in verse 13. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, when he had been defeated, he persecuted the woman, okay, God's people, symbolic of God's people, who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and a times and a half a time. In other words, for an indefinite period of time. However long this persecution is going to last, God is going to take care of her. Okay? So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth. Again, he couldn't defeat Christ himself. Remember when Christ was born? It's recorded in Matthew chapter 2. How much effort Herod put into finding where Jesus was so he could kill him. That was part of Satan's ploy. Well, it failed. And of course, Christ was raised from the dead. He took the power away from Satan of death, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. So again, he couldn't defeat Christ personally, and so now he's going to go after the people of Christ. So he spews out water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman. He's trying to... You think of the images we see of floods, of particularly, the last few weeks here, particularly in Louisiana, and we see the tides rising, we see waters rushing in from the Gulf of Mexico, and those waters, they carry things away, they carry people away, they carry objects away. That's the picture here with this flood that's following after the woman who the dragon is persecuting. He wants to carry her away by the flood, but the earth helped the woman. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out. What does Satan spew out of his mouth to carry people away? I think of John chapter 8 and verse 44. He's a liar. He's been a liar from the beginning. I think the spewing here and the flood that he's trying to carry the woman away with is deception and falsehood. And in fact, I think Revelation 13 that we'll study tomorrow, Lord willing, proves that to be the case. He tries to carry her away with a flood of lies, a flood of false religion and things of this nature. But you know what? The earth eats that up. The earth eats up deception and falsehoods. God's people do not. Verse 17, and the dragon was enraged with the woman. He couldn't beat Christ personally. The woman's not swallowing up the lies. And he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep... And so this identifies 100% who this woman is throughout Revelation chapter 12. He's trying to carry away the rest of her offspring. Well, who are her offspring? Those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. All right, that defines who the woman is. We know who the child was. We know who the dragon is. Now we know who the woman and her offspring are, God's people. Satan tries to deceive God's people. He tries to carry them away with a flood of lies. They don't buy it. They don't swallow it up. The earth does. And you notice there's a difference between those who dwell on the earth and those who dwell in heaven that we read about. And that's the imagery all throughout Revelation. You have heaven's people and you have earth's people, God's people and Satan's people. That's the imagery that's being painted here. So again, you go back to verse 12. Satan is on the earth doing his work, but God's people aren't going to buy it. So I have a few verses here under your outline. Again, the woman represents God's faithful. She went to a place of safety. So I put in your outline there Colossians chapter 3 and verse 3. Colossians chapter 3 and verses 1 and 2 talk about the fact that God's people should be looking above. We should set our affection on things above, not on things of the earth. Why is that the case? Listen to Colossians 3 and verse 3. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. I think you can safely insert Colossians 3:3 to Revelation chapter 12 and see this place of safety where the woman fled. It's in Christ. That's the place of safety. And in Christ and a knowledge of His will, we're not going to swallow up the lies and the deception that the world swallows up. And again, Revelation 13 talks about government deception and religious deception. God's people don't buy into that stuff. I think Revelation chapter 12 is pretty easy to understand. You let the verses define the symbolism for you and you see the picture. And again, this is the broader scope of Revelation. God and His people, God and His cause versus Satan and His people, Satan and His cause. And that's the battle. That's Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. Do we know where Satan came from? So that's all I'm going to deal with here in Revelation chapter 12 today. But Diane asked a question. Do we know where Satan came from? Well, I think we do. There are a couple of passages that answer that for us. One of the first ones, to me, for some reason I turned to my concordance. I was going the wrong direction. 1 Timothy chapter 3, talking about the qualifications of elders. One of the qualifications of an elder is that he not be a novice. Kind of a word we might use for novice is rookie, a beginner. This can't be a new Christian, because he might be lifted up with pride and fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Okay? So I'm going over to the book of Jude real quick. And Jude beginning in verse 5. The purpose of Jude was to warn the audience that he was writing to about false teachers. Here's what he says. I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And then verse 6. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, He has reserved in everlasting chains unto darkness for the judgment of the great day. Now, Peter touches on that very same thing. So that's Jude verse 6. Then over in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4. And it's the same subject matter. The subject matter is false teachers. Verses 1 through 3. But then he says this in verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and deliver them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. We don't have the biblical account of when this took place, but there was something that happened with the angels of heaven. It involved pride. Again, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 6 or 7. And when you put that together with Jude 5 and 6 and 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, that there were angels who chose in some way to rebel against God, and they were cast out. According to the biblical text, that's the origin of Satan. He was not created. Now here's an interesting thing, because we're actually, in the biblical text, we're not introduced to Satan until Genesis chapter 3. We don't know when Satan became Satan, but we do know from those 3 New Testament passages that it occurred sometime, obviously, before the encounter with Adam and Eve in the garden, as recorded in Genesis chapter 3. Okay, hopefully that answers your question. But Revelation 12 is not talking about that. Now, I know some people use Revelation 12, and particularly verses 7 through 9, to say, well, Satan and Michael, and no, Revelation 12 is not talking about some prehistoric battle in heaven. Again, God doesn't have to fight wars on His own turf. He just cast them out. All right? Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, guys, I appreciate you being on here today. I don't see any further questions or comments. Okay, so Wayne shared a link to the 2018 Power Lectureship and Brother Tom Waycaster. And I know if Tom Waycaster preached it, it's going to be good stuff. So in the comment section here, you can follow that link to YouTube. The Power Lectureship is very good material. So thanks for sharing that, Wayne. That's all I've got for today. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and hope to see you back here tomorrow as we will study Revelation chapter 13. And let's see what this flood of lies is that the dragon spewed out of his mouth. That's what chapter 12 mentions, and that's what chapter 13 explains. Okay, one quick thing here. Mark comments, if angels can fall, then it's arrogance to teach once saved, always saved. You got that right, Mark. I was taught that in Revelation. Oh, I was taught that in Revelation is why I asked the question. Yeah, I got you. Diana. Yeah. Again, there's the book of Revelation is used in a lot of ways that are not good. Let the symbols define themselves. That's the best way to understand the whole book, okay? And as always, if you have any questions or comments while I'm talking or even after the stream is over, feel free to add it in the comment section. Feel free to send me a private message and I'll respond to it. So thank you all for being here today and hope you have a good day, and I will see you back here tomorrow.